In some of Australia's Indigenous communities, being rich might be as simple as having a full fridge. That's one of the findings from the report Money Stories, which was released today. It surveyed over 600 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, looking at what financial resilience means to them. For more, we're joined from Melbourne by Yorta Yorta man Ian Hamm, the chair of Indigenous financial literacy body, the First Nations Foundation. Ian Hamm, welcome to the program. These are some stunning figures, and yet I suspect not entirely a surprise. What were the key findings and standout points to you?
Good evening, Jeremy. Look, one of the key findings, or a number of the key findings that really stood out for me, is that only 1 in 10 Aboriginal people feel they're financially secure, and 50% of our people feel they're in financial hardship. They find it hard to meet daily living expenses or the usual expenses that a lot of non-Aboriginal people take for granted. You add on top of that the feeling that many people have around access to financial services or difficulty in accessing financial services. So there wasn't a lot that surprised me, but I think really what this report does is bring it all together in a statistical way that we can see the evidence.
And to be clear, these statistics stand in stark contrast to what is experienced by the mainstream population, that these disadvantages are particularly pronounced in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community.
Oh, absolutely. They're diametrically opposed to what the bulk of Australians feel. For example, we had, I think it was around well over 50% of people feeling that they are not going to get on top of things, as opposed to 11% of non-Aboriginal Australians. That's a huge population difference. And when you think about, one of the things that really sticks out in the report to me is some of the anecdotal evidence, where many people feel that having a full fridge makes them rich. Now, in one sense, it's a good thing. We all desire that. But it's really pointing out that people have very low aspiration or feel that they can't actually want for more than what a lot of people take for granted. I think that particular result from the survey shows to me that we have a long way to go in terms of Aboriginal financial well-being.
How do these people view the systems which caused them to end up in that position in the first place, having experienced such long-term, multi-generational disadvantage?
Oh, look, many Aboriginal people feel detached from the finance sector or accessing finance systems. It's not for want of wanting to do so, and indeed some financial institutions have gone to effort to engage with Aboriginal people, but there's a fundamental disconnect between the Aboriginal community and the financial sector. That's what we really have to address here, not just the provision of more products, but a deeper understanding by the financial sector of how Aboriginal people view the world, what we regard as important, how we want to do business with the financial sector, so that we actually look in the long term, move away from just what is the problem of today, but really look at where do we want Aboriginal Australia to be in a financial sense in the next decade or indeed the next generation.
So how has that gap emerged if, as you say, financial actors in the financial community, banks for instance, have made an effort to engage with and to understand at-sea communities?
I think that you've probably answered the question there. They've sought to engage with Aboriginal people, I guess, as bank here, customer there. That's how they usually do business. But I sometimes question how much do they really understand the Aboriginal community? How often do banks, we think about the banks providing services to Aboriginal people, but I think it's equally important to have Aboriginal people inside the financial sector itself, not just as customers, but having people making decisions inside in the financial sector, working with Aboriginal communities, working with Aboriginal organisations who focus on the finance sector or Aboriginal financial wellbeing as equal partners. And I also think federal government needs to be engaged in this as well, to show leadership not just in fixing problems, but having a strategic approach to where we want to be in a decade or a generation.
One of the things that's structurally difficult to address, and this was a finding in the report, was the social and cultural practices and values, particularly unwritten obligations when it comes to family and friends and sharing your income. How much is it a reflection that they're perhaps not catered to in those sorts of frameworks?
Oh, look, I think that's actually a really good point about the fundamental and conceptual misunderstanding look, a lot of non-Aboriginal Australians have about Aboriginal people. When we talk about advancement, we are under assumption a lot of the time that Aboriginal people want to be like non-Aboriginal people. That is in fact not true. The cultural obligations, the social obligations, they are intrinsic, the centrepiece of who we are. We wouldn't be us if we didn't have them. However, they do create unique circumstances for us that those who want to work with us, such as the finance sector, have to really understand and have to actually cater to, and not ask the Aboriginal community to change their understandings and how they relate to each other to fit into the service system, and in this case the finance sector.
Indeed, one of the findings of the report was that 3/4 of respondents, of these more than 600 respondents, said they share money with family. Nearly half said they do so often or a lot. That is quite significant when you're thinking about someone's assets and liabilities in the traditional context that we do.
Exactly. So there is that big obligation of what is mine is ours and we share it collectively. But when you think about that statistic you just read out, yet reflect on that earlier statistic that only 1 in 10 Aboriginal people feel financially secure, only 1 in 4 Aboriginal people feel like they have enough money to get by, that sharing puts an obligation on people, but you don't say no. People ask you for support, whether it's material things or whether it's money. You have an obligation to provide it and look after them, because you yourself one day might be in that position where you require their assistance. That's how we work as a community. It's how we work as a people.
Did you see a gap between city dwellers and those who live in regional Australia where opportunity or a lack of it can actually be more pronounced when you're living in a smaller community?
Oh, look, absolutely. I think this plays out in a number of different ways. Certainly the rural economy, Aboriginal people are not immune to what's happening with the rural economies around Australia, the remote economies. I think what a lot of people fail to understand is the social and economic pressure or disadvantage felt by Aboriginal people in urban areas. When you look at the basics of how Aboriginal people are disadvantaged, it's the same across Australia, but how it plays out, how it's understood, how well you can see it. It's easier to see it in rural and remote communities than it is in urban communities. But social and economic exclusion in the western suburbs of Sydney, for example, it's no different there than it is in remote communities such as Yuendumu. You feel people who feel left out of the economy, people who are disengaged from having aspiration, and fundamentally, if you don't get the economics right, a lot of the social issues will never be addressed simply by social policy alone. So we do need to really have a proper economic understanding of the diversity of Aboriginal people across Australia.
These disadvantages are not necessarily exclusively felt by people who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. What similarities or differences can be gleaned from dealing with the sorts of disadvantages that people in those communities face versus disadvantaged people in the mainstream community, and how we help those people as well?
I think, and this is probably one of those things where we look to Aboriginal communities for leadership, rather than viewing my people as a group that needs to be lifted up and needs everybody raining, to be honest, their goodwill upon them. Look to Aboriginal people for leadership. If we can get the Aboriginal circumstance right or economic opportunity right, surely to goodness that can be applied to a whole range of other disadvantaged communities, because after all, we are at the bottom of the socio-economic scale. I think also that consideration of how do we integrate economic policy and social policy, that they can play off each other instead of being viewed as separate things. And when you look at how communities and people operate, or how they relate to each other, there's lessons in that for the rest of Australia as well, and we can actually learn from the Aboriginal experience and apply it in other areas across Australia, both in all the circumstances, that's remote, rural, regional and urban.
One of those actors we perceive will have a lot of influence and power in this area will be our new Minister for Indigenous Australians, Ken Wyatt. I note that there are a lot of expectations already being placed on what he can realistically achieve. Where are you setting your expectations?
Look, I have great hope with Ken being elevated to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. But I'm also a realist to know that he is one person. There is a huge weight of expectation. He's a member of a government, and it doesn't matter how long he's in the portfolio. One person cannot fix everything. But he's the first person who has ever occupied this particular ministerial role who brings to it more than a rudimentary understanding based on negative statistical data of what Aboriginal people are. Ken is black. He's lived it every day of his life. He will live it every day until the day he dies. He understands the complexity of being Aboriginal, the subtleties of how we work as a community, and the great difficulties we face that you can't measure in statistical data. But he also knows what's good about being Aboriginal. He also knows what's right about being a black fella. He brings that that unique understanding that no other previous minister has to this role, and so I think he will take us in a direction. He mightn't get us there, but he should set a direction that no future minister or government can wind back.
To what degree do you think he can take the rest of his colleagues, the Prime Minister, the leadership team of this government, into the future along with him?
I think he very much will be able to do that. He is a respected member of the government. He's respected on all sides of the parliament. I know that he and his Labor counterparts, Aboriginal people in the Labor Party, meet regularly or meet often as an Aboriginal parliamentary group to discuss common issues. I think his standing in the House is unique, certainly as the first Aboriginal person. It is in the Cabinet itself. I'm very hopeful that his colleagues will respect his wisdom on where Aboriginal Australia can go, and I think you'll find that a lot of Aboriginal people stand ready to work with him on his agenda for the future.
Ian Hamm from the First Nations Foundation, it's good to have you on the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.